How can you make vivid collage papers that don't fade, or get a watercolor look that's waterproof and won't bleed? All these inky papers are light fast and waterproof. The color doesn't reactivate with glue or water, making these papers ideal for collage or art journal pages. I make these gorgeous papers with India ink and rice paper. In this video, I'm using Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India ink, which is waterproof once dry. These inks are vibrant and saturated straight from the bottle. They can also be diluted with water to create watercolor effects that are permanent and won't reactivate once they dry. For rice paper, I'm using sketch paper. I get the large 12 by 18 inch pad and cut the papers into smaller sizes. Today, I'm printing on 6 by 9 inch sheets. You can experiment with other papers, but I think rice paper is the best for these techniques. It absorbs the ink instantly and the color goes through to the backside, so you get double-sided papers. For all of these techniques, I'm working on freezer paper with the shiny side up. The waterproof non-stick coating helps protect my work surface. You can also let wet rice paper dry on the surface and it will peel off cleanly. For the first two papers, I'm also using a sheet of Mylar. You can use any plastic surface, even a gallon-sized zipper bag. Brush strokes. I slipped a piece of my paper under the Mylar to act as a guide for where I need to put ink. I have the paper I'm going to print on ready off to the side. I'm dropping ink onto the Mylar over my paper guide. I'm using 3 different ink colors so I can create a gradient effect. I'm using a large damp brush to quickly spread the ink across the Mylar. I started at the top and brushed back and forth to the bottom of the page. Quickly, while the ink is wet, I put a piece of rice paper smooth side down onto the ink. The ink absorbs instantly into the paper. Just as quick, I start pulling the paper back off and you can start to see the brush marks that have transferred. I thought my paper got stuck to the plastic, which can happen if you wait too long to pull the paper off, so I set this whole sheet of Mylar aside, thinking my print was ruined. But at the end of the video, I'll show you that the paper came off the Mylar and it's one of my favorite prints from this session. Confetti dots. For the next technique, I'm using rubbing alcohol or isopropyl alcohol. I have my Mylar set up again with a sheet of paper underneath. The paper I put under the Mylar is the same size I'm printing on, so it's my guide for where to put the ink. I'm dropping ink on the Mylar the same way I did for the previous print. I'm using the same 3 colors to create a gradient effect. I'm using a damp brush to spread the ink across the Mylar and letting the colors blend together. Then I spray the ink with rubbing alcohol and it beads up. I quickly put my rice paper smooth side down to pick up the droplets. The ink instantly soaks through the paper. On this first print, I didn't spray enough alcohol and the ink didn't bead up enough in the middle, so I got a big blob across the print. I'm going to try again. I drop ink onto the Mylar, spread it out with a damp brush, then spray it with rubbing alcohol until all the ink has separated into small droplets. I quickly put my rice paper smooth side down onto the ink to pick up the droplets. This one turned out really nice. These confetti dot papers are so fun to make. I use several of these as pages in my scrappy art journals that I use for mark making. Want help remembering all these inky paper techniques? Grab these free printable prompt cards. They have photos of each technique and step-by-step instructions. You can print them as large 3.5 by 5 inch cards or fold them in half and glue to make smaller double-sided cards. They're available now in my free resource library at the link in the video description. Stamping bottle caps and lids. Another technique I love for making inky papers is stamping with bottle caps or lids. This is a metal lid from a spice jar that has a nice wide lip. This small lid is from the top of a spray bottle. I like it because it's tall and easier to hold on to than a thin water bottle cap. I'm also using an empty tape roll which has a double ring. You don't need a lot of ink for stamping. I put a few drops directly onto my freezer paper, then add a little water with my brush and spread out the ink into a small puddle. I dip my cap in the ink, but before going to my rice paper, I do a test stamp on copy paper. I want to make sure I don't have too much ink on the lid. I'm stamping rows of circles onto my rice paper, reloading the lid for each stamp. The ink feathers out slightly on the paper, which is a cool effect. After I fill the page with rows of circles, I go back and stamp more circles in alternating rows to create this pretty overlapping pattern. Next, I'm stamping with the tape roll. For this one, since it prints the double ring, I'm keeping it simple with straight rows. It was a lot harder to get the right amount of ink on the tape roll. It was also splattering everywhere when I lifted it from the ink pool. But in the end, I really loved the variety of marks it created. For some reason, this print reminds me of a printed deli paper you'd get at a restaurant. I think it'd be fun to experiment with making different patterns using this tool. Now I'm stamping with the spray bottle cap. This is going to give a totally different effect. Because the opening of the cap is so small, it's prone to getting a bubble across the rim. When you stamp with a bubble, it makes a filled-in circle with a lighter center. I think the effect is so much more interesting than just stamping small rings. For this pattern, I stamped circles in a column down the page, then I alternated the next column so that the circles are nested as closely together as possible. Stenciling. Stenciling is another way I love to use liquid ink to make inky papers, but as you can imagine, stenciling with wet ink on rice paper could make a huge mess. My secret weapon for crisp stenciling is an ink blending brush. These are typically used with ink pads, but you can use them with wet media too. I have a whole video on using blending brushes to stencil with watercolor on any type of paper. Definitely watch that video for more examples of this technique. I'm using a small amount of ink and rubbing it into the brush before I start stenciling. I also like to test on scrap paper to make sure the brush isn't overloaded. On the rice paper, I'm repeating the same stencil in multiple places around the page. I'm using several stencils to make a collage of patterns. When I switch colors, I use a different blending brush so the colors don't mix. You can't rinse out blending brushes like you would a watercolor brush to switch colors. They retain too much water. It's better to have multiple brushes. I have this cute little rainbow set. You can water down the ink to get lighter colors, but you have to be careful about loading the blending brush with too much water. So I use a regular brush to add water to the ink puddle and mix it up. Then I dab a little bit of that mix onto the blending brush and rub it in a circular motion off to the side. I always test on scrap paper when I use watered down ink. If it's bleeding on copy paper, it will be even worse on rice paper. With the watered down color, I can stencil over parts of the previous stenciling to create a layered effect. The stenciled ink dries really fast, so you can easily keep adding more layers without smudging. Here's a bonus tip. You can clean the ink off your stencils with rubbing alcohol. If you put the stencil on a clean sheet of rice paper, spray with rubbing alcohol, and wipe with a towel, the ink you're cleaning off the stencil will transfer to the rice paper. You can make a nice bonus collage paper while cleaning your stencils. Resist rubbing. For this next technique, I'm getting out a bunch of different texture tools. You can use anything that has a slightly raised texture. For this first piece of paper, I'm using the bottom of a plastic dessert plate. I'm using a white Neocolor 1 wax crayon to transfer the texture to the paper. You can use any wax crayon for this. This works so well with rice paper because it's thin. Just make sure to hold the paper firmly while rubbing the crayon. Let me hold this up to the camera so you can see the white crayon pattern. Before I add ink, I want to get another piece of paper ready. For this one, I'm going to make a patchwork of different patterns. I'm placing the different textures one by one under different areas of the paper and rubbing them with the crayon. It's okay if they overlap slightly. You can see up close all the different patterns. Now I have both papers laid out on my freezer paper. This is a separate piece of freezer paper that I can set off to the side while these papers dry. Rice paper is very fragile when fully wet, so I let these papers dry in place without moving them. I've diluted my ink in a little water and I'm using a 1-inch brush to cover the entire piece of rice paper. You can see immediately that the white crayon resists the ink. I wanted to add in some more saturated color, so I dropped some darker ink directly onto the wet surface. I tried to brush it out and blend it in more, but the paper started pilling, so dropping concentrated ink was not the best idea. On this second paper, I painted the paper with the diluted teal color first. Then I added blue ink into that watery teal mixture and used my brush to paint it gently onto the wet paper to avoid pilling or tearing. That worked much better. I'm moving these off to the side to dry. I'll show you how they turned out at the end. Lazy stenciling. I know I've said I love a lot of these techniques, but this one is by far my favorite. It's so quick and easy. You won't believe how amazing this technique turns out. It's my lazy stenciling method. I have 3 sheets of rice paper ready. I have them on a separate piece of freezer paper because they will need to dry in place. I also have my stencils ready. I diluted each of my 3 ink colors with a small amount of water. I'm using a large brush to paint a gradient of color across the first piece of paper. This color looked a little light, so I added some more ink to my mixes and painted a second coat. I immediately put a stencil on top of the wet rice paper and pressed it down. Now I just have to wait for it to dry so I can show you how magical this technique is. On the second paper, I painted a gradient going a different direction. I painted 2 coats to make sure the paper was saturated. Then I immediately put a stencil on top and pressed it down, making sure the stencil makes good contact with the paper. It will kind of stick to the wet paper. For the third paper, I painted a diagonal gradient. I painted 2 coats and then immediately added my stencils. I used 2 smaller stencils on this paper. Now, these need a few hours to dry. Don't lift or move the stencils until the papers are dry. You'll have to watch to the end to see how these turn out. Splattering. One more idea you can try with ink is splattering. Stain your papers with diluted ink first and let them dry fully. Then splatter them with India ink or metallic ink. For larger drops, use a small watercolor brush to splatter. You can tap the brush against a finger on your opposite hand or use the pointer finger of the hand holding the brush to tap the ferrule. For even finer splatter, use a toothbrush dipped in ink. Hold the brush so the bristles are toward the paper and use your thumb to run across the bristles. You may want to wear a glove if you don't want an inky thumb. You can use this splatter effect to decorate plain papers or as an additional effect to finish off any of the other inky paper ideas. While those papers are drying, let me show you how the rest of the inky papers turned out now that they're dry. Here is the first one where I printed the brush strokes on Mylar. It has a lot of really interesting texture. I thought it was stuck to the Mylar, but once it was dry, the part that was stuck peeled off. Next, these are the fun confetti dot papers I made using the rubbing alcohol to force the ink to bead up. Just as a reminder, this is what happens if your ink is too watery or you don't use enough rubbing alcohol. The ink won't separate into droplets and you'll get big blobs. Here are the stamped papers using a small jar lid, empty tape roll, and a small cap. This is such an easy way to make patterned papers, and circles always look amazing. On the rice paper, the ink feathers out slightly, giving these an added texture. And this is the stenciled paper using the ink blending brushes. The stenciling is so neat and crisp. Because the ink layer is so thin, these stenciled papers dry almost immediately. And this was the bonus paper I made while cleaning the ink off the stencils. Now, let's see how the crayon resist papers turned out. I love this radial pattern. This is the one where I dropped the concentrated ink onto the wet paper and tried to brush it out. Unfortunately, the paper started pilling, so I discovered I can't brush the rice paper too much when it's wet. So for this other one, I painted the paper with the teal color first and then added the blue ink to my paint mix, not the paper, and brushed it on gently. It worked a lot better without ruining the paper. I can't wait to show you how the lazy stenciled papers turned out. Are you ready for this? It's so magical. These are still a little bit damp, but they're dry enough to remove the stencils. When I lift up the stencil, you'll see these papers stenciled themselves. The ink is almost completely gone from where the stencil was touching the paper, and the stenciled image is so crisp. The ink and stenciled pattern goes all the way through to the back side of the paper. It's a little lighter, but still makes double-sided paper, which makes this a great technique for dyeing journal pages. Just imagine how many papers you could stencil at once using this method. Don't forget to grab your inky paper prompt cards so you can remember how to do all of these techniques. Get the free printable at the link in the video description below. I love using these inky papers in art journals. The smooth rice paper is great for mark making and even gel printing on. For a quick and easy way to make your own art journal, watch my scrappy art journal tutorial next.